Hey everybody, and Tony here with my review of Jonas Kaufmann The Tenor, which was released from Sony on February 25, 2022. The conductors were Pier Giorgio Morandi, Antonio Pappano, Bertrand de Billy, and Asher Fish. The pianist was Helmut Deutsch. The orchestras were the Parma Opera Orchestra, l'Orchestra dell'Accademia Nazionale di Santa Cecilia, the Bayerische Staatsorchester, l'Orchestra del Teatro Massimo di Palermo, and accompanying Jonas Kaufmann were his fellow singers, the bass Antonio Pirozzi and the soprano Cristina Opolaes. The more I listened to Jonas Kaufmann more critically, the more I realized that he does have some vocal faults, especially toward the later parts of his career. When he started out as a lyric tenor, he did stand out quite well, all thanks to his uniquely dark timbre, which put him above other tenors who sang the likes of Belmonte, Ferrando, Tamino, Cassio, the Duke of Mantua, Alfredo, and Rodolfo, and even more French roles like Werther and Don José. However, his PR and conductors, who probably didn't have an idea of what good singing sounds like, noticed him. They thought that his uniquely dark timbre would make him more advantageous in the more dramatic tenor roles. So as he was taking on the likes of Maurizio from Adriano Lecouvreur, Manrico from Trovatore, Otello, Tristan, Siegmund, Parsifal, and Lohengrin, what I noticed about his voice was that he artificially darkened it to give off the impression that he can sing more dramatically. And his recent yet questionable tenures as Siegmund, Otello, and Tristan are certainly indicators that his voice was never dramatic to begin with. It's just that his PR and conductors kept on encouraging him to sing more of these heavier roles, and I'm also pretty sure that it also did a huge number on his instrument, which is quite a shame because I did enjoy Jonas Kaufmann in his prime before all the PR and before all of this huge acclaim, let alone fame, that he ended up acquiring. And despite him maintaining that virile tone that makes him stand out quite well, it's still kind of marred from some hoarseness and some throatiness, which were his Achilles heels. And here's the $1,000,000 question that I'm sure a good number of you commenting below will ask me. Why is it that you keep coming back to Jonas Kaufmann? It's rather simple. He is sufficiently charismatic in every role he sings, and barely 7 years ago I did admire him when he sang Otello at the Royal Opera House. Yes, he didn't have the overall huge size as Ramon Vinay did, let alone the complete package that the likes of Francesco Merli and Mario del Monaco possessed. However, he still had sufficient charisma in terms of his skills as a stage actor, and he still had that uniquely dark timbre in his voice. Yes, it's kind of marred by throatiness. Yes, it's marred by hoarseness these days. Yes, these days it's marred by woofiness. However, if I'm willing to take all of those issues that Jonas Kaufmann has away, he is still a pretty involving and inviting singing actor, despite some of the questionable material that he has, and despite his technique becoming way more questionable than ever before. And speaking of his charisma, that's still one thing that attracts me about Jonas Kaufmann. His charismatically virile charm and that type of affability that he has as a person, let alone as a celebrity, still managed to make me feel thoroughly invited with whatever he's doing thus far. And this compilation album, Jonas Kaufmann The Tenor, was a fine testament to see how well he can specialize in not only his native German repertoire, which ended up coming really late and at the very end of this album, but also French, specifically Werther's Pourquoi me réveiller and Don José's La fleur que tu m'avais jetée from Werther and Carmen respectively, but mostly the Italian opera arias as well as the Italian art songs and even some modern classics like Caruso. And yes, in terms of arias like La Donna Immobile from Rigoletto, Donna non vidi mai from Manolesco, Recondita Armonia from Tosca, Nessun Dorma from Turandot, and even his duet with Cristina Opolais, O Suave Fanciulla from La Boheme. Yes, he doesn't really have that Italianità quality. Yes, he doesn't have that spadavoce quality that I admire in many Italian tenors like Giacomo Lauri Volpi, Mario Filippeschi, Enrico Caruso, Alessandro Bonci, Fernando De Lucia, Giacinto Prandelli, and Carlo Bergonzi. However, he is still sufficiently charismatic in these arias and Italian art songs. He even stated in some interviews that he felt more accustomed to singing in Italian rather than in his native German, mostly because there's a lot more they can play with, like the vowels and the consonants, as well as a lot of the sweeping music that a lot of Italian composers are very well known for. There is no doubt that this album does offer a solid collection of the Italian opera arias as well as the Italian art songs that he specializes in, especially when they're compiled from other albums, most notably his Verdi album, as well as Dolce Vita from 2016. Nevertheless, I'm sure that a lot of hardcore Jonas Kaufmann fans would want more. Even with me being a lot more critical with Jonas Kaufmann these days with his technique, I still also want more. I would have loved to hear his rendition of E luceva le stelle, Che gelida manina, Addio fiorito asil, De miei volenti spiriti, and even Di quella pira. Those would have been exciting additions to this album. And if I wanted more French opera arias, it would have been nice to have him include Rachel Candu Seigneur from Olivier La Juive, and maybe even De Grier's solo aria Appuyer du Simage from Massenet's Manon. And if we're talking German opera arias, it would have been nice to have had him include Dies Bildnis ist bezaubernd schön from Mozart's Die Zauberflöte, to never forget about his lyric tenor roots. Those suggestions would have made Jonas Kaufmann the Tenor a much more exciting album. Nevertheless, I will give this album the benefit of the doubt in stating that at least the selection was solid, especially with having Johannes Brahms' Wiegenlied as the closer, to show that there is that time for softness and quietness and tranquility amidst all the passion and all of that fire and all of that excitement going on in this album, especially for a lot of hardcore Jonas Kaufmann fans. As for my personal highlights, I did enjoy his renditions of Parla più piano from Nino Rotta's The Godfather score. Torna Sorrento, Cor Ingrato, and Caruso were absolute delights. The same thing I could say about Musica Proibita, Mattinata, Volare, and Voglio vivere così. And that particular Italian art song was quite fun to listen to because of how catchy it was, as well as Asher Fish's mastery of the orchestra. So those particular songs were the major highlights of this album. And that's not to say that his arias were not the highlights. I did also enjoy his renditions of Donna non vidi mai and Recondita Armonia. However, in terms of Recondita Armonia, I have to say a few things about Antonio Pirozzi, who sang the sacristan. Yes, he did have a fine voice, and he also did his job well as the second player. Not to mention there is some darkness in his voice. However, what marred Antonio Pirozzi was his throatiness and his woofiness that was kind of a downgrade. But at least he played well off of Jonas Kaufmann as Cavaradossi. In terms of O Suave Fanciulla, I thought it was quite decent to listen to, especially with Kaufmann being paired with Cristina Opolais. Yes, Cristina Opolais in her prime was a fine lyric soprano before she tackled the heavier roles. And your Tenier's Mimi alongside Jonas Kaufmann as the Rodolfo was absolutely decent all around. She still had the youth in her voice. She was still able to convince me as this young seamstress. However, she sounded relatively thin and almost colorless. But that is not to take away Cristina Opolais as a fine lyric soprano who managed to hold her own as Mimi. In fact, she and Jonas Kaufmann did have fine vocal chemistry in that particular duet. even with her vocal thinness being an Achilles heel. As for the conductors, each of them managed to support Jonas Kaufmann in their own special ways. Pier Giorgio Morandi managed to exude charisma in La Donna è Mobile, especially when he bolstered that orchestra rather well. Antonio Pappano was basically very textbook in his approach to ensuring that the orchestra plays rather well with the instrumentation as well as what is written in the score. Bertrand Dubuis was also rather textbook in his approach in terms of what is written down in the score and what he has to do to lead the Bayerische Staatsorchester. However, out of all the conductors, Asher Fish managed to stand strong on his own, especially when he was teasing out some nuances in those songs. Whether it be those strumming strings in Parla più piano, or even those sweeping orchestral moments found in Torna Sorrento or Cor Ingrato, let alone Caruso. And he even played with a lot of nuances in Non ti scordar di me and Mattinata. He definitely stood out of all the conductors featured on this album. And I also have to give credit to Helmut Deutsch for his soft and gentle piano playing in the final track, Brahms' Wiegenlied, in which he was able to complement Jonas Kaufmann well. When all is said and done, this is still quite a decent listen in terms of people who love Jonas Kaufmann and even people who are casual fans of opera. However, as I stated before, I'm pretty sure that hardcore Jonas Kaufmann fans would have loved to have a lot more arias featured on here, would have loved to have a lot more art songs, and would have loved to have a lot more variety, not just predominantly Italian art songs or Italian opera arias, or even just having smidgets of French opera arias, let alone having one German art song. A lot more variety would have made Jonas Kaufmann the Tenor a lot more listenable, especially for hardcore Jonas Kaufmann fans. Overall, Jonas Kaufmann the Tenor was still a decent listen. Yes, there could have been a lot more tracks in this album. Yes, there could have been a lot more variety and not just have this album be mostly comprised of Italian art songs or Italian opera arias, with only having 2 French opera arias and 1 German art song featured on here. Yes, we could have had a lot more French opera arias or German opera arias, let alone arias from Russian operas or Czech operas. Those would have made Jonas Kaufmann the Tenor a lot more exciting to listen to. But as it was, Jonas Kaufmann the Tenor was a decent listen and it was a solid best of album. And with that said, I give Jonas Kaufmann the Tenor 4 out of 5 stars. I give this rating because it could have used a lot more. Yes, I still admire Jonas Kaufmann because of his charisma. However, it was docked a few points because there could have been a lot more. There could have been a lot more variety, and there could have been a lot more selections featured on Jonas Kaufmann the Tenor. I'm pretty sure that a lot of hardcore Jonas Kaufmann fans would agree with me on this. And I'm also pretty sure that those who kind of criticize Jonas Kaufmann would have loved to have a lot more refinement in his voice, or would have loved to hear him sing more lyrically, or even have a lot more of his lyric tenor origins be featured on here. Regardless of whatever faults Jonas Kaufmann the Tenor has, it's still a good listen, especially for those people who admire Jonas Kaufmann to a T. And for those of you who listened to Jonas Kaufmann the Tenor, what'd you think of it? Did you feel that the track selection was good, let alone decent? Did you feel that there should have been a lot more to be added into it, like a lot more French opera arias or German opera arias, let alone arias from more Slavic operas? Did you feel that the conductors also did their jobs in providing Jonas Kaufmann room to perform well? Or did you feel like this album was not really to your liking, let alone substandard? Please let me know in the comments below. And also please let me know of your suggestions on how to improve Jonas Kaufmann the Tenor, at least the album. Well, that's it for my review of Jonas Kaufmann the Tenor. Tune in later for my review of Insieme opera duets featuring Jonas Kaufmann and Ludovic Bézier. So until then, have a great day, everybody.